Title of the panel, formal panel of the fishbowl is capitalist money versus money of the commons. The idea behind that was simple. There are multiple critiques of capitalist money as is. We have already heard an introduction to that. Basically, private issuance backed by state power, scarcity of medium of exchange, the imposition of store of value on that medium of exchange, thus more scarcity and hoarding. At the same time, there are multiple ideas for a money of the commons or multiple monies of the commons around in the crypto space and in other spaces as well. I thought it would be good to first go a bit deeper onto what are actually the problems a capitalist money is, or fiat money currently is causing for economies. And the other question would be what different ideas of a money of the commons are around. What does the money of the commons have to fulfill? How would it, for example, relate to care work as well? And there are several different approaches. For example, Disco is, well, they're not really issuing money. They're, however, trying to account for care work. There are also experiments with cryptocurrency in, for example, in Macau, that is a squat in Milano. And they have been doing that since 2014-15 with Common Coin. They also have universal basic income. We also have, we hear notions of a money of the commons or a post-capitalist monetary system in the context of a billion tokens, basically every good being tokenized and every good having its own monetary reflection. Whether that makes sense or not, I think could also be a matter of discussion. If anyone wants to stand up for that part, I figure would be the token engineers around. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I was hoping for participation from Italy, from either Andrea Fumagalli or other people from Macau. Unfortunately, Andrea has a conference that he's attending, and Macau were pretty busy with COVID last time I talked to them, so we do not have anyone here from them this year. I do hope next year. And yeah, thanks to our panelists slash fishbowl, initial fishbowl participation. Yeah, let's get started.
Maybe I'll start off, and there may be a question in there that we can carry on to the panel. So I was speaking with Michelle Bowen sometime this past year, and we were speaking about sort of this hesitancy to use money in the commons. There's this assumption, this trauma, that we are always talking about extractive, cold money. And I introduced the concept to him of warm money as money that, you know, is issued under any of these other paradigms, mutual credit, producer credit, et cetera, et cetera. And he really took to that sort of cold money, warm money paradigm because it opened up the difference in assumptions. We've talked about this a few times over the past couple of days, that, you know, the form of money we are default talking about is the kind of money that exists predominantly in the world today, but as we are all here discussing these other forms, can these two forms interact? Or, I mean, what happens when you mix cold water and warm water? I mean, it kind of becomes lukewarm, and then it probably cools off, entropy, whatever, so you have this, like, can cold money and warm money coexist? How do we allow for different types of currencies to intermingle without losing the value that some produce that others may extract?
So Matthew talked about what money does and the definition of money, and when you really think about what is the function of money, this idea of even store of value or exchange of value is a little random, because how do you value something? And we're having a conversation here, and there's some value in this conversation, and there's no money in the conversation. And when I have people look at what do you do for money versus what do you do that it's not a money generating activity, it's almost random. is just almost random if people just list in their life. And so it's like there's this idea that money is representing value, but I don't think that's what it's doing. And so what I prefer to say that money does is reallocation of resources. And when you think about money as reallocation of resource, then you can get very clear about this extractive thing, right? Like somebody reallocated a resource, so I've got this on my body, right? Now, what is the resource they reallocated, and which resources got reallocated when I put money into something? That's starting to be an interesting question. Then you start thinking, okay, wait a second. When I'm using this money, which resources am I reallocating? And that's an interesting way of thinking about it. It's only one of the functions of money. Money is a coordination mechanism. We're using money as appreciation, right? When we say we want to incentivize somebody, incentivizing somebody, it might be because they need some basic need, and that's money. Or it might be because they feel appreciation. If you dish praise, right? It's like, oh, I got praise. But if you dish too much praise, like if I got praise every hour, it would lose any meaning. Right? So you can only incentivize something like appreciation if it's sincere and not too frequent. So it's very interesting when we think about this, right? What are we using money for? The problems with capitalist money that, Felix mentioned, there's a couple of things. And one is just this idea, capitalism, right? That money should render money, interest-bearing money versus demurrage. This is a huge problem when you think about how much time you work and how much money that makes versus capital making capital. So that's one of the problems with the capitalist type of money, is that capital gains capital, and that always will cause centralization. And anybody who's looked at some of these tables that Will Ruddick has done and these simulations, it's very obvious. As soon as you add interest, you get centralization. It's just one of the problems that we have in our current system. And that has nothing to do with issuance. It doesn't. If the government issued fiat money without this interest-bearing thing, if the government just printed money, like you'll hear people say, the government prints money, and as Matthew pointed out, the government doesn't print money. The banks print money, and they print interest-bearing money, and as soon as they do that, it's a big Ponzi scheme, because automatically, with the issuance of debt, you owe more than you just got. That's the definition. Debt, right? You got 100 and you owe 110. And so those have nothing to do with the fact that they're issued by the government, or what they have to do with they're issued by the banks. They don't have to do with the authority issuing them. Those things have to do with what do we say is valuable and how do we do interest-bearing money. So when you're talking about like the money of the commons, it really doesn't matter who issued the money, but if it's interest-bearing money, you're going to get those specific problems will come with any interest-bearing money. So it's not a question of who issues it and who owns it and who's got the authority. Sometimes it's just an issue of whether there's interest-bearing or not interest-bearing. So that's kind of the first thing I would point out. And we all kind of know right now, everybody's kind of become aware of the fact that the amount of money coming out is making this into one big Ponzi scheme. But it's always been one big Ponzi scheme. And we all know what happens in one big Ponzi scheme. Everyone knows what happens in a Ponzi scheme. And so here we are kind of at the end of the Ponzi scheme. Like, how many more years of the Ponzi scheme do we get before these economies collapse and everybody's scrambling? So it's very, so I wouldn't say that that has to do with the issuance of who the authority is, but how it functions.
I'd like to talk about the scope of capitalist money. When I think of the word commerce, it's a whole area of activity in society that we put our professional energies into. And this excludes, of course, the care economy. So commerce dates back to a very, very long time, but it's all about moving goods and services around and paying money for them. And it's done within a legal realm, so the government has basically always regulated commerce. And it's a thing. And the marketplace is where commerce happens. That's the definition of the marketplace, if you like. And money is a part of that system. And what's happened as capitalism has got stronger and stronger is the realm of commerce has been increasing. It's like a viral feature of the capitalist money or of that system. It has to grow. So the marketplace is always including more and more things, and the realm of commerce is including more and more things that used to be in the commons or used to be elsewhere. Maybe even the marketplace would increase to include the care work, because it has to grow somewhere. But then you have all kinds of problems about paying mothers money for doing what they would do anyway, and then you have to regulate the quality of it and all of that. So when we talk about capitalist money, it covers an area of society which we all have in our minds, which is commerce, and all the voluntary work and all the homework and social work is just not there, and that's why it's not funded. It's just not part of that realm. So I wanted to define it. We think about money as something universal that flows through society, but it really belongs to and serves and is created by an artificial social story or creation called the commercial realm, which has grown to include almost everything.
And it's not so funny what you said about care work. I mean, we have mostly, in much of the West, monetized that. I mean, it used to be you lived near your mother and she took care of the kids in the afternoon when they came home from school.
Also babysitting.
Yeah, and now you pay for somebody for aftercare, and you pay for somebody to take care of your old mother too. And so we have outsourced that.
They're probably from Eastern Europe or Latin America, if we're in Germany, for example. It happens a lot in Berlin. And then there is it will be interesting to maybe talk about, for me, both about wage labor and about this hierarchy of value, where certain bodies are valued as more, profitable, or that they are allowed to have better wages than others. And then, of course, the social reproduction at the base, gets paid nothing or gets paid very few. So for me, it's interesting to think about, between these circuits of what we call production and reproduction. We have the capitalist money going from the production to the reproduction, right? But there is currently no money for the commons. And for me, thinking about wage labor and ways to abolish in wage labor, one way in which you can do that is, of course, through this idea of a universal or unconditional basic income, which is a way of creating a different money with different values that effectively frees people from wage labor, and also creates the conditions whereby you can have a currency for the commons, or currencies for the commons. Now, of course, in practice, this is very complex, because then we're talking about the state. So the state issuing a money, and so how would it issue it? Would it come with a debt? Would it be with a demiresh? Would it be a no interest? And so on. And I think if we're talking about this realm of capitalist money and commons, how do we create the conditions to fund a transition, or to create a transition where that can happen? Where people are effectively free from wage labor, so they could have the time and the space to reproduce their own life and the times of others without commodifying all of life. But then also at the same time, you do need the capitalist money to do that transition. So that's the contradiction I feel like we're in at the moment.
Well, if you go back to reallocation of resources, right, we're talking about UBI. And it's very interesting. What is the resource you're trying to reallocate? And you're trying to reallocate, basically you're saying people shouldn't have to work all the time. There's enough stuff for people. And so one of the interesting ideas I heard, this was actually from Mary from Holly Chain. She said, what if every supermarket had a free aisle? Now, this is an interesting idea, and there's a couple of reasons it's interesting. It's because now really nobody has to work, because nobody's going to go home. Right? Even if you don't have shelter, but you can walk into the free aisle and you can take some food. The other thing it does, so sometimes we talk about free rider problems and universal basic income.
Where were you?
There's this really interesting essay by the name of about what about if it was just the children? And nobody worries about free rider problems. And if there's a free aisle in the supermarket where you can get food, you never have to worry about children getting hungry because their parents are druggies. Or whatever else, children will go to the free aisle and they take the food they need. And so, again, when you just go back to basics, what does that mean? Well, it's reallocation of resources. And then how much does it matter who the authority is providing that food, right? Now, it does matter because we know a lot about, if you've read Poverty Incorporated, right? Or you've seen this. Right? It's like, okay, now they're starting with government subsidies and the Americans are sending rice to Haiti and killing the Haitian economy, and et cetera. But the idea of, okay, there's just going to be free food for everybody. And maybe it's just a basic food or a little food or something farmers might be thrown away, or what was left over from the restaurants last night, or whatever. That starts to really create this economy of, okay, I don't have FU money, but I don't have to take a damn job because I can. And maybe that's easier than monetary allocation of resources. And that's a commons, right? Every group can decide how we do that.
Just to remind anybody can come up and join if there are other opinions. There's a couple of empty seats.
I have a question about because we already discussed this when the hierarchy of value. Maybe you can tell something about the anthropology theory of value.
Sure.
And,
So I think it's interesting. There's this concept called interpretative labor. So like the peasants or the slaves know all the gossip about what's happening with the aristocracy and the king. The king has no idea. But they're at the top of the pyramid, right, of value, let's say, right, they're sovereign, and they have no clue about what's going on at the bottom. So effectively, if you conceive as value as a set of practices or like the way in which we give meaning, to our own actions, effectively what's happening now is that we have a hierarchy of value whereby the actions of the people that reproduce life and take care of life are effectively exploited and invisibilized, let's say. Whereas the people who, let's say, have the big ideas and are the Silicon Valley CEOs and so on, are the ones that produce value, so to say. And so the paradigm that we're in, in the 19th and 20th century, you had social movements that could install a labor theory of value, whereby, it was very macho-like. It was like, value comes from your work, and we're all like communists and so on. But it was very, very many. So how would it be like to create a value system where it's actually social reproduction care is at the baseline, and we can dismantle the current capitalist hierarchy of value.
okay. Other questions? Question?
No, I was just
I do want to address this thing that you talked about here about like how do we have this integration, and you also talk about warm money and cold money. And I think we know the answer to that, right? Because the whole idea behind Bitcoin and Ethereum and whatever is like we're going to create our own commons money, right? That's commons, that's the money of the commons. Like we're going to create it. And that's the comparison I use is like marriage. Right, it used to be, and it still is in some places, that you get married in the town square, right? Where you come from, you go in the town square, and there's a whole big thing. I've seen them on the right, and now you know that person is married. You shouldn't fool around with that person, right? That's what the purpose of having this big wedding is. Everybody knows. Now you go to a courthouse and you get a piece of paper, and the authority says you're married, and it's a very different thing, right? And that's how I think about blockchain and Bitcoin. It's like. It used to be the authority says this money, now we have money of the commons, right? We all say, it's all in the town square, it's all public, everybody knows, here's the ledger, and not to mess with the money.
It's a bit like feudalism, but in a virtual realm, kind of.
You could call it feudalism or whatever you think, but it's the difference between like, it's in the town square and we all are stewards of it, and the stewardship comes from above. Now I've got a piece of paper saying I'm married, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you think about it in those terms, right? If what Ethereum did right at the beginning was say, okay, we've got this money, let's buy some land and some solar panels and some, satellites, and anybody who wants to be in Ethereum world can come live on our farm, and we'll figure it out, or whatever, right? Then you would have a separate economy. But as soon as you said, we've got an exchange rate with fiat currency, and we don't have any petroleum, and we don't have any electricity, and we don't have any internet access, actually, or computers, but we're an ecosystem, it's like, well, no, you're not. Okay, and you get swallowed into this thing, and that's why you see DeFi, you see the fiat world swallowing it. And this is the fate of commons money if you don't start saying, okay, well, what is an ecosystem? And where are the edges of my membrane? And how do I create a membrane that is separate? Now, it won't happen overnight, but that's why I keep talking about this, like, this kind of well, Matt's talking about interoperability, but also this kind of underground. How do I know somebody's a member of that ecosystem? And how do I understand the resource economy, which you've been talking about, of that ecosystem? And what are we missing in that resource economy that we better start? Oh, you know what we don't have? We don't have a water source. Okay, let's look around, who's got that? Oh, we don't have, now we've got a water source, we don't have a plumber. Okay, you know, like, and if you can start to create a membrane that is less and less dependent over time, and that's your ethos is we need to be less dependent on the fiat system, then you can have money of the commons, you can have exchange or whatever you want in your group. But if you are going in this trend towards dependency, and this is what, you know, Will and I talk a lot about this with the grassroots economics, a lot of these bringing banking to the masses is just bringing people into the system. And it's like, okay.
Financial inclusion,
right? And I was saying to William, I'm like you, I moved to a third world country when I finished university. And within 10 years, it became just like everywhere else. And it's like, if that's where you're going towards financial inclusion, you're just going to get a copycat. And so, but that's hard, right? And there will be sacrifices. And the question is, what are you willing to sacrifice? Right?
So I guess it's about creating commons infrastructures, right? Like what you say really resonates with me in the work that we're doing in Berlin, because, for example, working with farmers in Brandenburg, it's often tough because, you know, you have very small and medium farmers which are actually providing like ecological alternatives to the monoculture. But then you have the issue of costs, essentially, like sending the products to Berlin is just very costly. And they all have a little car and they all drive in and out. And so it's like, okay, how do you organize with them together so they can share that cost and create this common infrastructure that then can be paid in a common currency, right? But the problem is that then you get, as you said, untangling a weed, no?
Yeah.
Because then you suddenly realize that there is this whole structure funded by the EU which basically benefits and subsidizes the big farms, and then you're like, okay, how do you know, it's a structural issue, right?
Yeah, where'd the road come from?
Exactly. and so it's like, you know, there is this moment when you're there and you're trying to build these commons, and you're like, okay, if we actually want to create this commons or infrastructure of the commons, you really have to struggle against and with at the same time these structures, right? Because it's a structural issue that farmers in Germany, for example, in Berlin, have zucchinis which are worth 30 cents more than the ones that come from Andalusia, which are created by slave labor, essentially, right? So how is that possible? That you have in the same store, like the same, you know, vegetable, but there is like a, you know, again, the hierarchy of value, right? And so we need to create infrastructures that allow it to be cheap also in Europe, you know, for local farmers to produce the food that they, you know, that they need. So then the people like Ethereum Foundation can be like, okay, how can we put money in those places, you know? I think if there's anything interesting about this sort of idea of mixing the crypto commons is that, you know, if you have people with wealth, with capitalist money or with digital assets, how can you funnel those funds into creating those infrastructures and then allow for a more local, regional, and productive economy to take place?
I would say it completely differently from that. It's really interesting, like we're going towards the same thing, but I'm basically saying, look, at the end of the day, they're people.
Yeah, of course.
Right? People built the roads, people whatever, people are the gatekeepers. And so we're talking about like, okay, how do we get that out of the hands of the government, right? And you're saying, well, if we can make our zucchinis cheaper, I'm like, no, that's not the game. You lose that game. You lose that game. It's a game, but you lose it, right? It's like, how do we make sure that farmer knows that he'll be taken care of when he's old, his children will get an education, and we are his insurance? Because why are people hoarding money? It's because nobody's going to take care of them when they're old, and nobody's going to take their children if they die, and nobody, whatever. Now, if you're in a network where you know that's taken care of, and you don't have to be on the goddamn treadmill that you know is like, you know you're probably going to lose that game, right? We all know that we're probably going to lose that game of, you know, having enough money for our retirement and for our children's sake. So if you can create a game where, like, if you're in the game, okay, it's a harder game, you're not gonna, but we're gonna take care of each other, and we're not guaranteeing it because we're just starting out, like, it's like, oh, maybe we'll take care of each other, like, maybe we can, right, like, maybe we can, but, right, that, then you can create this, like, okay, you're not gonna lose your farm, and maybe your son will actually take it over, unlike in this system where, you know, farmers in Europe are committing suicide. We can't win the game of cheaper, we can win the game of more secure, maybe. Maybe. And we definitely can win the game of more humane.
Yeah.
Immediately. We can win that of more humane. And if you look at what really happens during tragedies and pandemics and whatever, it's like, I've got a loaf of bread, let's split it. It's not hoarding. At the worst times, you see the best in people. And it's like, okay, well, we've got a loaf of bread, let's split it. It's not going to be as easy, but it's humane. Maybe we can win that.
So I would like to chip in here because I think this circles back to the myths of the commons, and what you're describing here is not a debt-based relationship. That if you give something to someone, you are now having an expectation that that someone needs to pay back in some way to you. You're doing something or giving something to that person, and then the narrative or the myth that is driving your behavior is that, well, this person is probably going to appreciate this act that I did, and if that person repeats the same act of sharing something that they have, then what we are creating is at the end value being created and distributed among people, but we don't have to keep the accounting of it. And this goes back to the discussion on some of the points you were raising yesterday about the moment you start accounting for acts that you want to incentivize, now you're already losing the game. So then I think what is the myth of debt and how much that myth is rooted for commerce and capitalist life, that maybe before talking about infrastructure of how to transition from capitalist money to commons money is what software are we running in our minds, how are we relating with the people that we are interacting, because if we try to account for everything, then we're going to end up commodifying, the mother taking care of the children. So I ask myself, is there something still that we could account for when we interact in such a manner that is, rather than accounting for debt, accounting for appreciation, and not using this perhaps as a way to reward anything, but as a way to trigger discussions. Perhaps if someone receives a lot of praise and someone receives very little praise in a group, maybe that should trigger a discussion of what is happening with this person. Why is he not finding ways to contribute to the group? Maybe he needs just some guidance to find ways that he could be doing in the group, rather than using accountability just to have cold punishment or cold reward.
Well, I don't think, I wouldn't say we don't account for things, but what would it look like if we accounted for things as a group? We've got a loaf of bread. We have 10 loaves of bread, right? Like, as a group.
Yeah, I think that's really the key. The key is to focus on the membrane. So what is our membrane? When we say commons money, it's our money, right? So what's the membrane that everybody can recognize is the family, right? That's a family, and this is the money that comes into the family. It gets distributed. There is no accounting in there. There is contribution. So the question is, how can we extend that family membrane to maybe this membrane or this membrane? How many members do you belong to? And what does it mean that you belong to the membrane? How are you making the members of the membrane better? And if anything happens and there is some fund that arrives to the membrane, how do we divide it amongst each other? So actually this membrane is actually not a member of accounting, it's more of a member of mutual support. It's a membrane of, how do you call it? Solidarity. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
I think it also changes, it also changes how you see your problems. Like, like we don't have a plumber is a different problem if you're a whole group of people but we've got a little house where he could live or she could live with their family is a difference. Or our car is breaking down, right? It's like a normal individual has to say, I have to buy a new one. But a group could say, hey, let's teach all the high schoolers to build one out of spare parts. And so also when you talk about this membrane, it's like, how much money do we have in our commons? And what's the best use of that money? And then is there another solution for this thing we need to solve that isn't a monetary way of solving it? But I think that that's what money of the commons is. It's like, it's ours together.
And for the zucchini example, it's pretty much saying like, okay, who can produce food? And it's about supporting the network, and it's not for a price, because indeed you can never compete for something that is being shipped from somewhere else where it's more sunny or cheaper economically. But when you actually say like, well, this is my eggs and these are my zucchini, and I'm just giving it to the people I love, you're not going to actually ask for a price. You're in the same support network.
I had a question because, like, I like the metaphor of the membrane. I think it's like it's good, and it's like, yeah, something, it makes sense when you think about it, but one of the things that maybe I'm missing is that your membrane is interacting with the larger capitalist economy, and you have to sort of deal with that reality. You don't really have much way out of it unless you can truly find self-sufficiency on some, in some like little village or something. So like there are, I would argue that there are like larger class interests involved as people are interacting with each other, and that sort of define our relationship with like the commodities that we need to survive, and we like have to sell or purchase. So I mean, I was just curious where you felt like that sort of thing that at least I feel like you have to deal with comes into play. Like because we talk about the commons, and I think like it's a little bit of a vague term, but what happens if, you know, if I own private property here, but I also kind of want to be a part of the commons, but I also want to keep my private property because I have this power dynamic involved. Like how do you deal with that power dynamic?
I would say that the membranes are becoming increasingly smaller, and capitalism is pushing a lifestyle that is most individualistic, and then the membrane will end up being in just one individual, and everything is private, and you will be just transacting with everyone else. Yeah. So then is how do we foster lifestyles that you are willing to include other people in your in membranes, and how do you cultivate them, and how do you have them interact with each other?
So like part of the issue that maybe I'm having is that like if I'm a working class person, like in America, like I'm going to go to Walmart because it's cheap to buy stuff at Walmart, because I don't make much more money to purchase like the organic vegetables that like this, you know, nice farmer wants to start this little village over here to you know, make an eco village or something like that. I'm like, eco village, I cannot even begin to think about that when I'm trying to think about how I'm going to pay off my debt, or how I'm going to survive the next day, or pay rent the next month.
Well, you know, eco village you might not have to pay rent, and you might eat the stuff that is there. But if you want to live in the city, actually money is pretty much there for any situation in which you don't trust each other. And if you have the money, you don't need each other. And instead, membranes is places where you need each other. So it's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
And if you don't have local production, and if you're not willing to give services and support to each other, and you don't have trust with other people, then obviously you have to start thinking on ways through which you will strategize your life to get what you need. So I think that it comes down to starting to practice the commons and self-organization and local production and building capacity, so that those spaces where you would feel comfortable sharing the goods and services and skills that we all have become more numerous, and it becomes easier to be part of them and to have humane connections with the people that belong to those membranes. Otherwise, we keep shrinking and shrinking these membranes. And I don't think it's gonna be easy, but
I think you should.
I think it's, so there's a few answers and it's gonna be different everywhere, right? But more and more people know that they're losing the game, right? And they're desperate. And so you've got more and more people who know they can't win that game, the privacy game, right? And so then it goes back to this underground and how that's gonna look. So one of the things is making it really easy to join. And that's why I talk about reputation, like a couch surfing kind of thing, for example, is easy to join.
Yeah.
You can become, right? But then there's like this, if you think about the roads or the whatever, holes or the whatever, and who's building these things, at the end it's these individuals, right? And so then it's like, how do you make it easy to join the underground and sneak things through, right?
It's then you're, I mean, I feel like you're basically describing the kind of like the labor theory of value, like kind of like the things that's, what creates value is the fact that you are working on making this road, not like the guy who employs you to make the road. It's like
Yes.
you have to apply your value to make it happen.
And you're seeing that, but you want to see that you're seeing that, right? As the authorities crumble, like, and you've got to go and show your vaccine pass at the border, right? How many of those border people are really freaking checking because they don't get paid enough for that?
I don't think they checked mine.
Right. And so that's what's happening. You're seeing the crumbling of the employer of the road worker. And then it's just like, how do you get into this new economy? And you're kind of like, the guy in the government still thinks that they're paying you and controlling you, right? Like they still think that all of these restaurants in Vienna that are checking my vaccine passport are really checking my vaccine passport. But meanwhile, we've created an NFT that if you show it, it means that you're in and we don't check your vaccine passport, right? Right? And then it looks like you're showing your phone and then any guy walking by is like, right? And you create that, and so I think that's how it happens, because the guy at the top still thinks they're controlling it, but actually there's a whole different thing going on. I mean, that's what an underground railroad is. That's what the partisans were doing.
Yeah.
I think that's how it happens. I don't know.
Yeah, it's how do you, I don't know, I think, yeah, we have like, I think, like a lot of, like, I think, in like the average person is like a capitalist subject, and they're sort of like incentivized to think like Homo economicus, and to, you know, basically buy stuff as cheaply as I can and try to maximize my wage, and then but through that process you sort of are alienated from your common man, your common person. So like yeah, I think what we're trying to get at is like, how do we how do we build a membrane that's actually going to last and like expand? And,
Can I jump in, because I wanted to do intervention that I think it's really the point, and before I was to make an intervention on, yeah, let's think about economic and monetary alternatives that actually consider the masses and not just isolated cases, because it's quite simple, especially for us that we are like very qualified and very active to build our little communes or small ecosystems, and to be quite shielded from the capitalist system. In this sense, I think that one author is very good at framing this, because it is Eric Olin Wright. I don't know who knows it. Okay.
Olin Wright, yeah.
Yeah, he's an historian, and he studied all the theories on capitalist, anti-capitalist movements, and he divided them in 5 categories, which I'm not explaining, but the most successful for him, and I agree with that because I like, is the framework of eroding capitalism, which is like considering societies as an ecosystem in which you have the capitalist ecosystem, which is composed of many life forms and life rules, let's say, and to develop, like in an evolutionary process, alternative species that then evolve and can radically change the ecosystemic functioning of it.
So you're saying we need to evolve?
No, in this lens, economic alternatives are like new economic life ecosystems, which are developing, and in this sense, I think that the capitalism, it is basically an machine, an ecosystem that produces systematically misery and exclusion. So it's constantly making people miserable and excluded by its own system because there is a Ponzi scheme. And we are the ecosystem that is taking the people inside our system, which is the nice one. I'm making, sorry, quite confused. Before Grace said that, Matt, that the capitalist, the neoliberal push to commercializing everything is like a virus, but I think that commoners are a virus too for capitalism, because once a person gets included in a commons ecosystem, for example in a eco-village, and he freed himself from the labor slavery and from the consumer slavery. Yeah. Capitalism can't take it back.
But I'm curious how that happened, because I think the only thing that I can imagine right now is that you essentially have to play the game a little bit up until you reach like your wealth point, I guess. And then you like, all right, now I'm going to buy. I mean, some people do like, I'm going to go buy some land and like go start a sustainable.
Maybe you're poor, you can't pay your rent, and you know that in that eco-village rent costs a tenth of what you're paying.
Right. Yeah, of course. But if you're starting from zero, if you're starting from scratch,
there is not really zero asset people.
I mean, say like if
in the West, especially.
Well, basically, what I'm saying is that sort of having some money basically forms as well as a shield around yourself to not be exploited under capitalism. Like the point, the issue, the insanity of capitalism is that like the whole point of the game is to get out of capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. Like, as a capitalist, you don't care about like you're not suffering under it, right? You're basically excluded out of the labor market. Mm-hmm. So maybe more correct is the game is to get out of the labor market.
Yeah.
However you can.
Yeah.
But you go in a community, small or large, that have different functioning rules than the capitalist one, and which can interact with it, but it's quite autonomous. And if more and more communities get connected and get autonomous from the capitalist economy, the capitalist economy is collapsing.
But I think, but I mean,
and also capitalist economy is already collapsing, for example, because it's destroying you the amount of profits you made from producing use value. So we have more and more use value, and more people excluded that you can get into the commons ecosystems.
Yeah, but I think as well, like alternatives are tried, and like I don't know. I think an eco-village will not be able to defend itself against the military or like.
I think. So there has been sort of this thematic of membrane, and it kind of, I think it's not the only core concept here, but I think it's present overall. And so I make a couple of comments on, let's say, qualities and forms of membranes. First of all, I'll start with your point. Like the membranes are getting smaller. Yes, in a sense, but one has to at the same time say that the membranes are also getting larger. They're not doing one thing. Like there is certainly this sort of like the premise of the player level one, who is kind of being pushed to this sort of more and more individualistic position and is being exposed to the game, and then is trying to play itself to be not too exposed to it. But at the same time, there were comments on Walmart. Well, what is the membrane of Walmart? That is actually expanding, and it's also turning from more of a membrane to a pipe network more and more. Of course, it always has been. But I would really recommend, I mean, some might have done it, but like going through, there are some really good analysis of how supermarkets work. What is the distribution system? Like an hour on that gives you very useful information in itself, because it's a very thought out logic in itself. But it also points out how these structures that are constantly being enabled and innovated as forming these sort of networks become very efficient to the level that the world is kind of dependent upon it. Example, Brexit, empty food stores. Britain is quite a large network, But when it cuts itself out of the network that it's being part of, even that size of an operator is in trouble. So that's one thing. Like one has to look at the forms of membranes in a much more wider palette than just what's me. And then secondly, to the point of which has been a theme, there's sort of like a membrane that shields itself. And I completely agree with your point that once there comes an exchange rate to your closed ecosystem, that is a sort of an infiltration infection in itself, and we can see this in crypto many times. On the other hand, I think also forming a closed system, because of all the previous reasons we just mentioned, and other reasons, forming a closed ecosystem is an uphill battle. That is like looking at the sort of network nature of the world makes you always in the position of a weaker hand if you actually don't have systems to communicate, because the communication immediately when it happens makes you evaluated in capitalistic terms. So that and also your membrane might start bleeding at any point. When your ecosystem suddenly starts working and it's attractive, somebody comes and offers to somebody in the network, hey, if you would, I could exchange with you, and then the bleeding starts. And the likelihood of bleeding increases by your success. But there is another way, which is also an uphill battle, but it's still a kind of, I think, discussed too little in not just crypto, but I think in forms of, all the organizational forms we're talking about. And that is to try to design the system such that you account that you will be exposed, you will be evaluated by capitalism, but rather you want to include in the economy that is inside behaviors that whatever is coming in is transformed, is nudged into different behaviors. And that is not a magic pill. It will come with its own problems. It will be bleed. You will have to iterate on it. But it is possible. Not to kind of repeat my own horn of examples, but there are games that precisely create an area this, an area that. And when there is a sort of a common currency value point system, whatever, in the game, but when it enters into this area, because the behavior in this area is coded so and so, these same values actually have a different behavior than this area. And of course that's a very simple example, but it shows the principles, that in principle this is possible, but it's a design field where we need a lot more models, experiments, etc.
Perhaps this is more of a question which kind of follows up on the discussion now. But
I want to go there too, but I don't want to leave you alone. So
I can stay for a moment.
Okay.
So the question for me is, like, when we are speaking about membranes, but also Julio was speaking about kind of entangling the supply chains or the relations of the structures in which are embedded, and like what I'm realizing more and more is that myself, kind of the situational awareness of what is the actual resource flows and contingencies and like resource magnitudes, I know nothing about like what I'm embedded in. And even like when I start kind of thinking of what is the things I need and what is the resource allocation which is kind of coming to my t-shirt or like the food, I'm like illiterate and completely like ignorant. And I was thinking like in terms of membranes and the flows, that for example kind of the field of bioeconomics or the social metabolism, that they have very sophisticated ways how to map and actually visualize or even like make it more experiential. So what I'm kind of wondering about, if there's ways how we could start making those kind of mappings more embodied or experiential and included in our education.
Yes.
Because then what we could be doing, it seems to me, starting to be more realistic about like future scenarios. So what is actually realistic, like knowing that my bioregion or my town has this kind of like degrees of freedom, then what might be the transition steps, and what might be the scenarios if I like cut down my needs? Like what percentage could be realistically, I don't know, sourced locally? So yes, that's kind of what I'm wondering if and how.
And just to complement that, in agreement, is that I think it would be great that inside this learning crypto commons, crypto in general, there would be a group or groups that would take the topic of, let's call it network literacy, which would also just map out and study, like, okay, here's this form, here's that form. And there is a lot of knowledge you can really mine quite easily, like, okay, what kind of network forms actually these supermarkets use. Like I can tell inside one day, you can be, like even half a day, you can be quite informed. Of course, there's a lot of details, but it's a very valuable information. So mapping this and saying, okay, we make a diagram out of this, and hey, we know that they have this kind of a system we are not using, etc., etc. And of course, that's not the only one. Like you can look at all the resource flows, etc. And having that for me would be an increase in literacy, because we are making network forms. There are many other forms, but they are certainly network underneath. So if there would be a source of creating a library literacy discourse around different network forms, that in itself, I think, would be a beneficial part of study to the process.
I'm not entirely sure if I'm following the membrane discussion or what you guys mean by it, but I wanted to jump in because something that I find really interesting about peer-to-peer credit or peer-to-peer issued mutual credit is that the networks that emerge, or the monetary system that emerges from this type of mutual credit, it sort of naturally ends up with local trusted communities having these monetary borders around them. So you end up with, this happens because the people that you make connections with, that you extend credit to, there are more of them, and they're within a community, and they also have higher capacity of trust within the community. And so you end up being able to, you have more liquidity within the community, and so you end up being more able to transact within your local community, even though you can still transact at the edges with other communities between trusted connections where they are. And I don't know, I just thought that this kind of dynamic is interesting. It's like a global system for how to set up, you know, when I think of like money of the commons, it's like, it's bottom up and it's inclusive, and it still encourages local circulation and of value, but it doesn't isolate communities. And it's not prescriptive either. It's organic and bottom up, based on real connections between people. And I mean, of course, there are. This is just about how the medium of exchange comes to exist and forms, and it doesn't say anything about the real availability of resources and whether that's going to meet the needs of the real flow of resources. But it's I don't know, when I think of money of the commons, like, I think it should be created somewhat like this, in this way.
Okay, if there's no direct answer to Aliza, I wanted to reply to both Peko and Jakub on this membrane versus the network of pipes, and not understanding the degrees of freedom or lack of freedom that we have to sustain the comfort that we enjoy nowadays. So this makes me think of, in this transition to more autonomous lifestyles, it's on the one hand learning by doing, and on the other hand is reappropriating the production workflows, because all these corporations are using people's knowledge and skills to function. So I asked myself if we cannot just take all that knowledge that is already there, or ourselves, that many of us work for these corporations, to start having exercises of try to apply this knowledge and this capacity to provide for ourselves, and understanding how difficult that might be, but also what shortcuts we can take to sustain a sufficient degree of comfort, and slowly building that capacity to slowly transition to now invoking again membranes that are more capable of upholding a certain degree of comfort. And then I wanted to also reply to Josh. He was saying that, well, we want money to escape from those who want to exploit us with money, but this seems to be an arms race. Like, yeah, you want atomic power to protect yourself against those who have atomic power, but then that brings you into the same mad battle. And then the only way to win the game is not to play. And not to play means that, well, you still need to eat and get shelter. So how do we start providing that for ourselves? And then obviously, these membranes that are based on trust and care, if you don't know the person, then you will feel reluctant to provide for them, and that's when maybe this mutual credit system comes into play, because then you can still have value flows to people that you don't know by chains of trust, and that breaks that can be something that breaks the isolation of the local membranes that are based on knowing each other on a daily basis, or being in the same, having vicinity, and starting to unlock all the value that gets produced locally.
I would like to just come back to, it's really fast. I would just like to come back to the point that Pekka was raising, and also to Alisa's point, and also to you about, like, I guess if you call it like different metrics or ways of understanding, the healthiness of the human economy, as opposed to GDP, for example. And this is something we're working with Teodoro as well now, also with circles and Sardex and grassroots and many other projects, is this idea of the arborescence, or like, you can think about it as a membrane or a tree, but if you look at a network, you can see the clusters whereby, for example, you have a baker and the transporter and the tomato maker and so on, and you could see the power that they have, the relative power that they have in the network. So who's more systemic than the others, no? And all these ways, and you can account for many different ways. So you can also account for care and how much, how interconnected are they within this membrane, within this like tree. So like one idea is to say, okay, like, most regenerative economy projects, we have a map, let's say, of where we're doing our thing, project, but we need a compass. So in essence, if we are really serious about providing an alternative or making an alternative, we need to create exactly some metrics based on philosophy of science in general, to really, when we do them, say, listen, we also have research that proves that this is more regenerative than GDP.
Kind of ties for me like an idea, and perhaps it's happening in some ways, but when we are speaking about like the sense making around what is the flows or the possible supply chains or like network connections. So if each agent is kind of sensing or experiencing their own kind of perspective. So for example, if I'm a supermarket, I know pretty well some spheres of my inputs and outputs, right? And so if we were able to incentivize or somehow encourage sharing of more of like I imagine it's like in Warcraft, then you have the fog of war, and then you make allies, so they share kind of their their visibility. So it's kind of finding ways how to encourage sharing of those partial points of view in an agent-centric way, and perhaps like using some methodologies so it's like quality data. So this could be some way how to start kind of re-embodying.
Just a warning, we do have like 1 or 2 minutes left in this panel, then lunch starts. You can continue the conversation, please, but you will lose your moderation membrane, so please continue the conversation. Lunch goes for an hour and a half, so self-moderate.
Yeah, I just had one thought that popped from this meshed membrane here. Membranes is also, yeah, I think what's so powerful about the digital commons and the cyber-physical commons and token engineering is that we can not just assign a value, but we can embed values because of the multidimensional nature of what we can do with tokens. So for example, I'm just going to shill our friends at IGZO who are working on embedding the economies with the things that we value, and the term of value is not just monetary value, such as instead of paying gas fees on the Ethereum network, we can create it for we can pay for carbon offsets. So I think that's one of the biggest problems as well with our money, is that value is so disconnected from our values, and now we can embed these systems from the bottom up and embed the values rather than assign a value, which is money, which is being a whore, as Grace always says.
It's a great closure.
Drop the mic.
Okay.
So on that constitutional note.
If there is anyone who wants to continue, or we didn't mean to obstruct, if there's more discussion to happen, absolutely please. And if there's anyone else who would like to continue discussing, this is really fascinating. But if anyone who's hungry, lunch is ready. And I think it's an hour and a half, and then the afternoon kicks off with maybe more fishbowl / panel / park bench stuff.
Absolutely.
Thank you.